Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Kimberly Horn. I'm the Global Claims Team Leader for Cyber and Tech Claims at Beasley, which is a cyber carrier. Part of my job is to lead a group of breach response professionals who help shepherd companies through an incident, whether it's a breach or a ransomware event, and help to facilitate services for them and line them up with esteemed experts, some of which are here today to help guide them through an incident. I also oversee a team of claims managers who evaluate the coverage for these events, and we provide strategic advice for companies as they deal with the liability that flows from these events. With me today on the panel are Bill Siegel, who's in the middle there. Bill is the CEO and co-founder of Coveware. He's a cyber incident response firm that focuses on helping businesses recover from cyber extortion events such as ransomware. Bill was previously the CFO of Security Scorecard, a New York-based cybersecurity ratings company. And prior to that, he was the CEO of Second Market and served as the head of NASDAQ Private Market following NASDAQ's acquisition of Second Market. Also with me today are Naveed Jam, who's the managing director of Mandiant Consulting FireEye. Naveed is responsible for the delivery of all Mandiant consulting services within the Western United States. These services include incident response, which includes incident investigation and remediation, forensic analysis, red team assessments, strategic assessments, security program and response readiness assessments, and other customized services. Also with me today, last but not least, is Stephen Rusa, who's the head of Norton Rose Fulbright's Digital Analytics and Technology Assessment Platform team. Stephen advises companies on a wide spectrum of technology and legal issues pertaining to privacy and data security. He serves as a partner in the New York office and oversees the development of the firm's privacy compliance tool suite, which is called NT Analyzer. So join me in welcoming these folks to the panel. So today we're going to talk to you about the epidemic of cyber extortion, in particular ransomware events, which have increased at an alarming rate over the past several years. We're going to start our journey here today by setting the landscape for everyone, kind of explaining to you kind of how we've seen the frequency, complexity, and severity of ransomware incidents morph over time and how the attack vectors have changed a little bit. Then we're going to explore best practices for those first critical hours of an event, including assembling the team of experts who are the service providers who are really going to help a company through that incident. And finally, we're going to walk through a ransomware event, talking about the roles of the various experts and the strategic considerations that companies should be thinking about as they navigate the ransomware landscape. So we'll start with you, Naveed, because you're the tech expert in all of this. Can you walk us through how the nature of a ransomware attack has morphed over time?
Sure. So we've definitely seen a stark increase in the amount of ransomware incidents over the past couple of years. I think you've all seen it in the news as well as sort of the public sector where it's being most impactful in terms of the decline of services of those organizations that have been impacted. The thing that we've seen mostly is before was more of a crime of opportunity. They would send a phishing email, someone would click it, and they would encrypt one system or a handful of systems, not necessarily knowing what data they had or what was even on the other end. Now it's become much more targeted and much more intelligent in the actions they take. So they're actually compromising these organizations, staying in the networks, moving laterally throughout the networks to find out where all the data lies, and then, in a patient approach, encrypting the data to hold that organization hostage.
And how are they able to get into the networks and stay in there and target them without being detected before they launch the ransomware attack?
Yeah, so the primary mechanism, I think we have a slide later, is through phishing emails. In addition to that, there's also general exploitation of internet-facing RDP vulnerable systems that may be there with weak passwords or no passwords that may exist, as well as just general vulnerabilities that may exist on systems that are internet-facing.
Okay. And Bill, how does this sort of changing nature of the attack, how has that changed the types of ransom demands that we've seen?
Sure. So as Naveed mentioned, as these attacks have gone larger and gotten more sophisticated, they've gotten more expensive for the threat actors to carry out. And that first slide was telling Josephine Wolf's quote about making ransomware unprofitable. There's two ways to make ransomware unprofitable. You can decrease the amount that they earn off a given attack by how much they extort, or you can increase their own cost basis. And it's important to think about an attack in this manner because this is a global industry. It's very developed. It has a supply chain. It has financing. It has specialization. And the people in the audience, your data is a cog in that industry. So making your data expensive is one way to combat it. And so when we talk about what has happened, to go back to Kim's original question, as the sophistication of these attacks has increased, as they've gone after larger targets, those larger targets are harder to get into, harder to achieve persistence in, and thus they cost more to the threat actors to carry out. Also, their monetization rates are lower. There's a much higher likelihood that the company has backups when they actually do drop the ransomware payload, and they don't ever have to pay, as opposed to a small, doctor's or dentist office that doesn't have anything. So they're going to monetize maybe 1 out of 10 as opposed to 5 out of 10. And all of this, if there's people in the, in the sales and marketing divisions of your companies, you realize this is all about cost of acquisition and the revenue that you can earn. When you think of it that way, you can see why, oh my God, these numbers are getting really high. Well, the cost basis of the threat actors is also going up correspondingly, and that's reflective in these crazy demands that you read about in the paper these days.
Okay. And what types of companies are they targeting here? Is there any correlation between the types of strains that we see of ransomware and the different types of companies that are targeted?
Yeah, for sure. So this slide shows a little bit of the, that when we slice and dice the demographics of the size of the companies, you can see that certain variants of ransomware have their sweet spot. So for instance, Dharma, which is arguably the most prevalent in its monetization, really only attacks small businesses. They really don't go after large enterprises, but there's a constant drumbeat of these cases. Ryuk, on the other hand, and the other Hermes variants really go after those big enterprises with those big demands. And Sodinokibi has kind of popped up as this specialty type of ransomware that's going after MSPs with these more sophisticated attacks. But when we look at these things, people say, well, is some industry exposed particularly? And the answer is, think back to how we think about this as a marketplace. Whatever's cheap, they're going to go after. Whatever is likely to be monetized, they're going to go after. Why did schools get hit this summer? School starts at the end of August. Haven't seen a whole lot of schools get hit since then. It's about to be October 15th. Watch the CPA firms get hit, because that's a tax date. So when you think about who gets hit and why, it's really more about who's vulnerable and who's likely to have to pay at that moment in time, so that the threat actors' economics are as high as possible when they attack. This kind of highlights the certain differences in these demands. You can clearly see here, Dharma going after these small companies. Small companies obviously couldn't afford to pay million-dollar ransoms. Ryuk attacks going after the big enterprises. They can, and Sodinokibi is kind of in the middle there, where sometimes they have very large attacks. Sometimes they're going after more smaller companies.
And these are just averages. I mean, can you tell us from your experience in negotiating these ransoms, Bill, what are some of the numbers that you've been seeing more recently, like some of the highest numbers in terms of ransom demands?
Sure. So the Hermes variants, the Ryuk groups, when they hit a large enterprise, you can expect to see a more than $10 million demand. Now that doesn't mean that that's what gets paid. It's a very complex process of understanding, does it need to get paid? How are we going to negotiate? What are the variables? But we're seeing demands, especially at the enterprise side, that are very, it's not uncommon anymore at all to see 7- and 8-figure demands out of the gate from some of these groups.
Yeah, I know from our experience of having managed over 1,400 ransomware incidents since 2014, in the early days, I mean, we were talking about a few $1,000s, up to $10,000 maybe. If it was $50,000, it was really high. Obviously, the price of Bitcoin fluctuates quite wildly, and it has gone up considerably since that time, and that has impacted the price of ransomware. But also, I mean, now the demands seem to be, at least from our perspective, regularly in the hundreds of thousands and oftentimes in the millions of dollars. Bill, can you speak a little bit to how successful companies can be in trying to negotiate these demands down to more reasonable numbers?
Sure. So the answer is everything's negotiable in life and in ransomware. So what matters in a negotiation is having leverage, and it's very hard to get leverage when you're getting extorted and your backups are wiped or encrypted and you really don't have leverage. But the leverage that you can get is understanding the data. And one of the things that we do is we aggregate data about ransomware cases, and we try and inform our clients, okay, it's RIAC, so here's typically the negotiated discount we can achieve in 24 hours. Here's what we can do in 48 hours. If you have 3 months, here's what we can do in 3 months. And we've negotiated RIAC amounts for that long a period of time. So it's always, and time is really the strongest lever that you have in terms of leverage, because it's the only thing that can truly demonstrate non-urgency to the threat actor. You can tell them all day long that you don't need the key and that you have backups. They probably know. And if you're emailing them every 15 minutes, they probably know that it's high urgency. And so not emailing them for a week is a way to demonstrate that we don't really need you and you need to come back to the table. So for enterprises listening, what you need to understand is the ability to negotiate is a reciprocal of the time that you have to do so.
That's good advice. So Naveed, you talked a little bit earlier about how bad actors are getting into the network. We talked about email phishing, software vulnerability, RDP. For those who don't know, RDP is remote desktop protocols. So when you give others the ability to access your computers remotely, like your IT desk when you're working from home, or your managed service provider when you're a smaller company that outsources your IT, that's a huge vulnerability. Can you speak a little bit in more detail how some of these vulnerabilities are created and how the bad actor can target you in that way? Like, how do they realize that you have these vulnerabilities?
Right. Yeah, so I mean, on the RDP side and software vulnerability side, there are scanners out there that basically crawl the internet looking for vulnerable services. They may particularly be targeting you and scanning you yourself. On the email phishing side, it's a fairly easy constraint to just try to phish a user. I mean, statistics show that it's pretty easy to phish most users in any organization. The key thing with ransomware is once you get in, you have to have access, right? So the first step in any phishing where a ransom incident is access to that host or computer. The second thing you need is credentials, so credentials to be able to deploy the software or malware in the environment. And then the third is connectivity. So those organizations that have really flat networks make it a dream come true for attackers to spread the ransomware as quickly as they can. And so they could do this ransomware spreading via manual processes. So in the olden days, they would manually run encryptors on a couple of systems, or they'd use bash scripts or scripts in general to do that, so Windows scripts and bash scripts on Linux systems, etc. The other aspect of it is they could automate a lot of that now, right? So they're using credentials that are in the environment, often found in memory on systems. They dump the local administrator credentials or domain administrator credentials, and then they basically encrypt in mass, basically using either built-in vulnerabilities like Eternal Blue that may have existed, or SMB type protocols, as well as PS exec and WMI. They can push everything out that way and encrypt in bulk, in mass, in whole organization. So they really take their time to figure out what all the assets are, make sure they have full reach, and then go about encrypting the entire organization for maximum damage.
And Bill, I mean, can you explain your chart here, sort of talking about how some of these attack vectors correlate with some of the strains of ransomware?
Sure. So, starting at the bottom of the market, if we look at the blue shape there, as Naveen mentioned, open RDP ports, you can literally Google that, like literally Google the IP addresses that have exposed RDP. Or you can just go to a marketplace and buy previously breached RDP credentials and just waltz right into a company. And so that correlates a lot with Dharma, because small companies tend to have that vulnerability open. They tend to get those credentials breached. And Dharma actors are generally non-sophisticated. They can't pull off a phishing campaign. They can't pull off remote code execution via software vulnerability. So they'll just go buy a set of credentials and they'll waltz into an IP address and they'll follow the instructions on the ransomware kit that they bought and hit the button and hope it works. When you start going a little bit sideways to the yellow, so Nikibi, they tend to leverage vulnerabilities. So a lot of the attacks that you've been hearing about on the MSP side are these RMM tools, which are, if left unpatched, can create catastrophic damage to not only the MSP, but all the MSP's clients. They're leveraging vulnerabilities in Jira that, if left unpatched, can be used for remote code execution. So a little more sophisticated. And then when you go up market to RIAC, email phishing, while getting a single user's credentials is relatively straightforward. Actually escalating and then moving laterally is actually pretty expensive and time-consuming. And so they tend to do those in the larger organizations where they know they can monetize it more, because they are going to spend more on malware, more on resources. They have to be more skilled people that they have to pay to do these things.
And Stephen, so at Norton Rose, you guys have your privacy and data response team. What are you seeing? I mean, you guys have traditionally been working with your clients on incident preparation and also on traditional data breach. Those still happen every day, but how does a typical ransomware situation differ from your traditional data breach?
No, sure. So believe it or not, it's a much more urgent situation. You have, with a data breach, certainly things can be bad, but many times it results in some type of notice. There's embarrassment, there may be some liability, but these things are somewhat known. But if you're talking about having your data unavailable to you, in your production environment, or it may be sensitive data for end users that may actually impact their health or safety, you're talking about something where it couldn't be more immediate. So we view it as the highest level risk that involves essentially pulling the 4-alarm fire klaxon to ring and have people salute accordingly, immediately get the experts involved in terms of the incident response folks, and then also make sure that there's buy-in and awareness at the very top of the organization, because it couldn't be more serious.
Now, are these investigations still incorporating in a breach response investigation aspect to them? And how does that all work? And what is the timing of all that?
Yeah, so I mean, it takes, it's going to be, again, it's going to be on probably a slower track than the ransomware attack and the availability remediation. Some of it may even simply come after, once the issue of the data has been solved. So there's definitely a prioritization of, secure the availability of the data, get your backups, get the environment hardened, and then, in terms of the breach side, it kind of scales that way. Some of it may be dual tracked, but you may have limited resources, and so you certainly prioritize the ransomware aspect.
Well, certainly in the early days of ransomware, as Naveed was talking about, these sort of more automated attacks where companies were being locked down by clicking on a link, but the bad actor wasn't actually in their system doing reconnaissance and moving through the network. We weren't actually seeing data breaches arising out of ransomware attacks. So we would do the typical incident response investigation and conclude that the bad actor actually wasn't in the system having access to any type of data that would result in a notification publicly. That's changed a bit, and we're seeing more and more companies have an actual data breach as a result of the ransomware infiltration. Naveed, can you talk a little bit about, from your perspective, how the incident response investigation differs when you're in a ransomware situation as opposed to a traditional data breach?
Right, yeah, that's a great question. So I think the key thing that's different is containment and how quickly you contain. During a traditional sort of APT breach, you would sort of want to take the time and not tip your hand to the attacker that you know about them, that you're conducting an investigation. You try to be stealthy in the investigative approach you took, right? And so that would lead to days or weeks or maybe even a month worth of investigations in the environment, identifying all the systems that were compromised, reversing malware, developing decoders, truly understanding what level of access the attackers had, and then working on a containment strategy to kick them out of the environment in what's called a remediation event or a remediation weekend. With now with the ransomware cases, containment is literally a day one exercise, right? So we come on site, immediately we understand what they have in place, what they don't have in place, and make recommendations to slow the propagation or stop the propagation and preserve the data that's not encrypted. So if there's backups that are online, for example, that can be immediately disconnected to preserve those, that's the first step you would take. There's firewall rules you can put in place to prevent moving between the different environments, to sort of try to segment them as best you can to sort of isolate those networks. So those types of very tactical, hands-on strategies become day one exercises as opposed to week 3, week 4 exercises in a traditional IR.
Okay. And when you come on site, and sometimes you're physically on site, sometimes you're remotely on site, but when you all are kind of in the thick of all this, how prepared do you think companies really are for this type of situation? I know there's been so much education about companies putting incident response plans in place, which really differ from business continuity planning.
Right.
I mean, there obviously is some overlap there, but the ability to okay, how are we going to respond to a data breach? Who's going to be in the room? Who's going to be in charge? Versus how are we going to keep our business running and get our business back up and running? How prepared do you think companies really are for this this type of event?
Yeah, so most organizations, depending on their size, really the small and medium-sized organizations don't exercise their plans or don't have, backups that they restore on a periodic basis to make sure they have those processes down. Larger organizations, may have annual tabletops or practices, et cetera, but they're often not skilled at sort of quickly deploying IT solutions. So being able to lock down their network in a timely fashion, right? So finding that right IT person who knows what they're doing to be able to make firewall changes across n number of devices is sometimes a challenge for them to be able to do. And that goes to show they haven't actually developed playbooks for these types of scenarios and actually exercise them on a frequent basis. Now, the larger organizations, like Bill said, are more mature, have more processes, have more robust business continuity plans, and have actually tested and exercised those. So that's why you see some of them able to better respond and restore from backups as Joe's dental office, for example.
Okay. Bill, what's your takeaways in terms of how prepared companies seem to be?
I would say it's mixed, and kind of going to the slides and also drawing on some of the things that were said in the last presentation. The role of the breach coach, I think, is kind of a special one to think about, especially for firms out here that have done tabletops before. You've been in the room with all the stakeholders. Everything's different when the bullets start to fly. And with the exception of the attorneys on the stage, we're a role player, right? Naveen's a role player. Kim's a role player. It's our job to execute in our swim lane, provide strategy, provide options, and feed that information up to the decision makers of the company so that they can say, okay, I'm hearing all of this, and here's how I want to proceed. One of the great, and we see all sides of this, I think some of the best breach coaches are also some of the best project managers. And it's because they know how to corral all the information that firms like ourselves and the role players are feeding up, filter it, make sure that it's kosher to be discussed, and then extract a decision from the company about what to do next. Otherwise, there are so many important people with important titles all at the table talking at once that it can be very difficult to actually move an incident forward. So I did want to touch on that because we are talking about breach coaches, and the prior panel did talk about how to organize these groups. When you do a tabletop, people are relaxed. It's a day off, right? I don't have to talk to my internal stakeholders. We're doing a tabletop. It's fun. Inside of an incident, no one has slept, no one has eaten. People are worried about their job security. And so the role of outside counsel that does it 4 times a day and has that experience can be really valuable.
And Stephen, on that note, I know Norton Rose does pre-breach services, right? You're trying to help companies mitigate these things from happening. I mean, when you go in and you do tabletops and exercises and look at incident response plans, how focused are companies on these types of events as opposed to, again, the traditional data breach?
So increasingly focused, just because it's become more prevalent, and I think it's kind of, now kind of top of mind. So clients are much more interested now than they were, I think, go back a couple years on this actually, and trying to get people to focus on it and prepare.
So now I actually want to talk about what happens when this incident occurs, when an employee clicks on a link and all of a sudden their computer goes dark. Maybe a ransom note appears, maybe it doesn't. Bill, can you really take the lead in sort of walking us through the different steps?
Sure. So when a ransomware event is actually clear and apparent, I won't go too far back in time, but typically there's been certain things. Your spidey sense has gone off because something weird happened in the network 24 or 48 hours earlier, and you shook it off, and then work starts and people's desktops aren't working, ransom notes are popping up, servers are going down. This is when the incident response plan needs to kick in. And if there's one kind of universal piece of advice, it's while it may seem like moving fast is a great idea, saving 2 hours off a 6-hour job and the mistakes that could get made because you're moving too fast can sometimes have catastrophic events. So actually slowing down, not trying to fix the whole thing in 30 minutes because there's pressure from the business side to get back up and running is kind of step number 1. Follow your plan, right? You developed it, you did the tabletops for a reason. Let's try and follow the plan. Typically in an incident where we're brought in, it's because paying may have to be an option. At least it's explored. And what we'll do is we'll run parallel paths. So we've got the IR team and the internal IT team is doing containment, making sure that the network is hardened. Someone is checking on the integrity and availability of backups, not rushing to restore them immediately. God forbid they just get encrypted as well. And that can take time. That could take 24 hours. It can take a couple of days. And guess what? That's totally fine. I can't tell you how many clients would kill to have a full backup on a UPS truck that arrives in 3 to 5 days versus not partitioning your network properly or rushing to restore and then having that get encrypted as well. But the parallel path we'll go down is you've got IR and IT on one side running that path, and we'll engage with the threat actor on the other. And we'll have an initial strategy of just ascertaining the demand, doing some cursory steps of having them prove file decryption. We're trying to pick up information as well, so we are casing their communications, their IP address, their email address, the type of ransomware, when they're applying to determine their time zone, and trying to narrow down attribution, not by, we don't have the ability to do the really fancy attribution like Mandiant does, but just have we seen this persona before? And then when we know we've seen that persona before, how did those cases go, right? How long did they take? How much did they cost? What negotiation strategy did we use? Was it successful or not? Do they have any weird personality quirks? What are the curveballs going to be? And we're going to try and lay out a strategy. We're going to be getting information back from IT and IR about severity and urgency, which is going to change every couple of hours. And we're going to start building a strategy on, okay, here's how we're going to deal with this threat actor. We're getting information from insurance about what are our limitations. We're getting information from the company, what are their limitations. And there's no set strategy at the beginning is the answer. Is we're typically checking in every 6 to 12 hours, and we're making modifications as we continue our negotiation track. Because circumstances change, and hopefully we reach a point where backups are good and we're ready to do a restore because we've taken all the proper steps, and hopefully at that period of time we've also arrived at a point where we're ready to make a payment. We've negotiated it, we've done all the checks, we've done all the regulatory things, and which one are we going to do? And hopefully we don't have to, and then we just hit delete on the email thread and it's over. But if we have to, we're glad that we spent those 2 to 3 days getting to that point, so we don't just start that once we know that we actually have to do it.
So Bill can speak to this better than I can, but for me it's fascinating to look at the sort of psychology or rationale of the person being extorted, right? So in some cases it's very matter of fact, you're a business person, your factory's down, you're losing $1 million a day, you have a $2 million ransom, and you've been down for 5 days, so no big deal, you pay the $2 million and move on. And other times it's $50K and people have a really hard time understanding or rationalizing that, depending on the approach. So I don't know, that's a question for you, Bill, maybe in terms of how does the psyche of
well, it certainly matters, and there are firms and there's public examples of we're just not going to do it, right? It goes against our morals, and that's fine. That's great. If your company can withstand that, then more power to those organizations. The other part of the psychology is really about understanding, and this is where having experienced teams can come in, because there's a big misconception that, okay, it's a terrible decision and we're gonna agonize over it, but once we pay, it's over. And that couldn't be further from the truth. And there's another conception that you pay because it's faster to recover. Also completely false. If you pay and you restore your data in your production environments, you know what's going to happen 24 or 48 hours later? They're going to come right back in and do it again. And so the time to restore between restoring from backups and actually decrypting actually favors backups for a couple of reasons. Number one, you probably still have to rebuild everything, or at least reformat everything. So that's indifferent between your methods of actually bringing your production data back in. But number two, when you risk weight things, right? On one hand, we're dealing with criminals, right? God knows what they're doing. God knows what they're, how they're going to behave. And then you're dealing with known variables. The tape's on the truck gets to Tennessee, you install the tape. Those things you can control. And so, I think a lot of the psychology on the business side is we just got to get back up. And the fastest way to do that, that's probably paying, because I hear that when you pay, you get the decryption key and it's over. And it's like, that's not true.
I'm glad you addressed that myth, because it really is a myth. I think a lot of companies think getting that decryptor key is like a plug and play, and your data all magically reappears in a perfect format and you can go back to business as usual. And what we find is number one, you have to introduce the data back into a clean environment. So there's a lot of forensic work, and like Naveed said, containment work that goes on before you can reintroduce data into your environment, whether it's from your backups or from the decryptor key. And then second, some of these guys go dark for days, a week. You might have negotiated, you might spend a few days negotiating the actual amount, and it take another day or two for the bad actor to provide the address for the Bitcoin wallet. And so, the company's really frustrated. Sort of, you're at their whim, really, of when you're going to get that key back. And then when you get it back, it takes time to actually decrypt those files. And sometimes the data is corrupted. I think one of the things, Stephen, what's a piece of advice that you could give, insureds that are going through, or companies, insureds for me, companies that are going through a ransomware event to sort of help mitigate the consequences?
As they're going through it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, without question, listen to the advice of the experts, and because of the fact that it's not their first rodeo, it's not their 15th rodeo. They do it day in and day out. And beyond that, I think that you have to maintain. I remember a law school professor once said to me, when it comes to solving these hard problems, our greatest virtue is calm. It's very hard to get calm in this type of situation, but to the point that the other panelists raised, that it's not a time to make snap decisions to relieve your agita of the moment, right? Like if it makes sense to take a little bit of a hit now to do it right, make sure that your data is, appropriately introduced back into the environment so that you're not facing the same problem. It's up to us as counsel and up to the tech experts to make sure that we lean on the client heavily to make those right decisions, because it is easy, and you see it. I mean, some of the toughest things we deal with is dealing with management that wants the pain to go away, and then it'll make bad decisions.
And Bill and Naveed, before we get to you guys on best practices, Stephen, in terms of legal considerations, right? I know a big issue for a lot of companies on pay versus not pay is, are there any legal consequences of doing so? I mean, the FBI's public position is you shouldn't pay the ransoms. It's going to encourage further criminal activity. But the reality of life for companies is if it's their only way to get back up and running, they feel compelled to make that payment, even though morally they may not agree with that decision.
Yeah, so, and certainly, and to kind of back my way into the answer, are you going to be paying an entity that's in North Korea or Iran? And immediately you'd think, this is like a real issue. But, most of the time, they would be a bad ransomware company if their IP address was localized to one of these jurisdictions that's on the Department of Treasury's bad boy list. So, as a result, and, as a firm, we've handled, many of these. And we haven't had a single incident where you couldn't make payment. We're advising you can't make payment as a matter of law because we believe that you're going to be violating the sanctions list. And we don't know of that happening and haven't heard of someone getting in trouble. That's not to say it couldn't happen. Obviously there's the FBI's public position, which they have to take, I think, for sort of obvious reasons. But I think what the public position is versus what the understanding of the practice is are two different things. I'm not aware of the FBI castigating anyone for having made the payment. I think they understand the business realities.
Right, and neither are we. I mean, we've certainly encouraged our companies we insure to bring them in, because bringing them in can only be helpful. They have tools sometimes that can assist. They have intel about the different threat actors and what they might have been doing in your network, things you might miss, or things that might take Naveed and his team, although they're stellar, a week or a few days to sort of figure out. The FBI might say, hey, this particular strain, this is the type of things they do while you're in the network, and be able to sort of tip you off to some investigative, give you an investigative advantage.
And actually, to come on that point, and this isn't so much as when you've had the ransomware attack, but it underscores how important the relationships can be with law enforcement, with the FBI, because we've actually had companies that have been notified by the FBI that they're being reconned or surveilled by a threat actor that is known for ransomware. So then the client goes and immediately takes, action to try and head that off, and successfully heads it off. And so
well, that's certainly a great outcome.
Yeah.
Bill and Naveed, can you guys speak to sort of your best advice for companies going through an event?
Sure. So, I mean, I think when you're going through an event, like Steve said, it's calm, right? So, trust the experts who've been through this rodeo a couple times before, remain calm, and then try to make decisions, as rationally as you can under those circumstances. Now, once you've made a decision and, based on the advice of the experts, it's also move quickly, right? So if the decision is to power systems off or segment systems or further, blocking credential reuse, et cetera, things like that. Take those steps as quickly as you can to spread the ransomware further. And then also, after the fact, right, try to get the lessons learned from this approach and further develop playbooks to, be able to respond to these events in a better fashion and further harden the environment from day one so it doesn't happen again.
That's good advice. Bill, any other pieces of advice?
Yeah, just I guess a few soft things. The prior panel really talked about the importance of the people. At the end of the day, it's unlikely that there's going to be a single technological silver bullet that's going to solve the incident. And the mistakes that we see made during a given incident are typically because of pressure and sleep deprivation and malnutrition. Like, these are crazy things to think about, but it's very real. People push themselves too hard. People are not cognizant of how hard they're pushing their team. And they end up making mistakes that can set a company back days or millions of dollars. And so, and this is part of the kind of the, slow down and think about it, go in front of the whiteboard, making sure you're taking care of your team, making sure that you're shifting work, making sure that people are eating and sleeping and staying hydrated. Because if their brains don't work, guess what also isn't going to work? Your plan and ultimately your restoration. And then the other thing I think about is I see this refrain a lot, and it makes my skin crawl, which is it's not the backups I worry about, it's the time to restore. And I mentioned it earlier. That leads companies to pull their backups closer into their networks, and the partitions drop because they're like, well, I got to restore quickly because I got a recovery time objective. And guess who loves that? Criminals, because they make it easy for the backups to find, and then they wipe them and they encrypt them, and then you are SOL. And so I cannot tell you, I'll say this again because I think it's important. I'm not talking about little dentist office. I'm talking about big multinational public companies that would murder to have backups on a truck that would take 3 days to arrive versus the situation that they're in because they were pushed to meet a recovery time objective that forced them to drop the partitioning of their network. And so not worrying about that, and guess what? The person that finds the properly partitioned thing, the proper tape, oh, I did it, like, they are the hero of these situations. And they don't care that it takes a couple days to arrive. So thinking about that, I think, is important. And when you're discussing those objectives on recovery time, not sacrificing the proper network partitioning, because I can tell you right now that multi-factor authentication are the two things that allow this sort of activity to take place right now and be successful.
And at Beasley, our number one advice would be call us, right? Because as your insurance carrier, we're not just there to pay your bills at the end of the day. It's, I think, what really sets cyber insurance apart from traditional lines of insurance. And all carriers, include, I'll talk about Beasley, it's where I work, but even my competitors, they all have services and they have relationships with the people who are standing here on the stage who can really help a company. And small and medium-sized businesses, they don't have plans in place necessarily. They don't have relationships necessarily with some of these vendors. Bigger company might. They might have FireEye or Mandiant on retainer, right? And so they know who to call, but not everybody does. So if you call your carrier, they can help facilitate all the service providers for you, line you up with the people that you need, and also be there to sort of guide you through that process. So without any further ado, we want to open it up to questions from the audience. Does anybody have any questions for our panelists? In the back?
Sure. So the cryptocurrency cat's out of the bag, kind of like the shadow brokers, all those malware tools are out of the bag, and you're really not going to get them back in the bag, unfortunately. You can drive it down market through regulation, drive it offshore. I think the financial regulatory organizations have a really hard challenge on your hands right now, where right now Bitcoin is used for two things: speculating and money laundering. But they don't want to be seen as stifling financial innovation, because then they'll just go to their competitive jurisdictions in Europe and Asia. But then how do you balance that with the stark reality of what it's used for? So I don't think we can count on cryptocurrency regulation solving this problem. But it is one of two, I'd say, if there's two cats that got out of the bag that allow this environment to persist, it's the prevalence and availability of cryptocurrency and free malware.
Excellent. Karen?
I am fortunate that I get to work with everybody that's up on this panel, so I already know the answer. But for the audience sake, can you walk us through what the process looks like when a customer goes through this, and who should they call first, and the way that all of you work together throughout the process?
Well, I think they should call me first so that I can help set them up with all these guys. But basically what you do is you want to engage legal, right? Because if you're going to bring forensics in to be investigating in your environment, you want to try to hold that under the guise of privilege, attorney-client privilege. So we always recommend that, whether it's a data breach or a ransomware incident. And if you have a demand, we always recommend that you call Bill, because he is going to help you kind of identify who you're dealing with in terms of the threat actor through the data that he's collecting from each incident. He's really been able to gather good intel on how these people are going to act and behave, and whether you're going to be able to negotiate that ransom. And most companies don't have their own Bitcoin wallets. How are you going to pay this thing if you make the decision to pay? Bill's going to help you do all that. So I'll let you guys kind of comment, but that's my take on that question. Naveed, anything more to add?
No, I think that's spot on. I mean, again, whether you call the incident response firm or the lawyer first depends on your perspective, but either way is an acceptable approach.
Yeah, I'd agree. The insurance should be the first call, number one, because you want to understand how your policy works. But number two, firms like Beasley have these breach response teams, and they move really fast. And they will bring all the service providers together, and they will cherry pick them for the size and shape of your incident, and they will put them all on the phone with you very quickly, so you don't have to go out yourself. And that's an important time saver.
Yeah. Stephen, anything to add?
Nope, that's it.
I mean, you might want to consider a crisis communication firm too. That would be another, service provider that you may want to bring into the mix. A lot of companies use their own internal communications folks. The lawyers certainly wear multiple hats and are crisis communicators for you.
Our job is generally to stifle the crisis communicator. But anyway.
Just one quick question. I was just wondering if you could speak on the possibility that the data will not be decrypted after payment, and kind of how these negotiations legitimize ransomware as a business.
Sure.
Sure. So on the data piece, I'll answer the easy question first. So different ransomware behaves differently, and so what we try and do is we look at the profile and topography of the network, the type of data, the year and vintage of the servers, the size of the files, and then we say, okay, it's RIAC. That is likely, based on the prior cases, to have, if we get the decryption tool, 95% of your data, if everything behaves as it has previously, it's going to decrypt cleanly. There are types of ransomware out there. There's one called Mr. DEC, where the data recovery rate when you get the decryption tool is 32%, because it just breaks stuff. It breaks SQL databases, it breaks big backup files, and you need to know that. If you're the business owner and you're saying, okay, I'm gonna get the key and it's all gonna work, and we come back to you and say, sorry, expect a 32% data recovery rate, you're probably gonna go down a different path to recovery, and you should. With regards to legitimizing the industry, it's a tough question to answer. And at the end of the day, it's the business owner's decision. This is a new thing, and it's talked about anew. It really isn't a new thing, though. If you look at the traditional K&R market, this is kidnap and ransom market, it's existed for decades. And it exists for a reason. It allows people to work overseas and feel like they can work overseas safely. Cyber insurance is no different. Now, K&R insurance doesn't validate that it's okay to kidnap executives overseas and ransom them. And I don't think that cyber extortion follows any different modus of a precedent. It's just a different theater of activity, and right now it happens to be hotly debated in the media. I think it's really no different.
And on that point of the market and at least looking at it through the legal lens, is our first analysis in terms of well, not first, but one of the sort of necessary ways that we look at things. Okay, what are we required to do under the law? Who do we have a fiduciary duty to? If the data is data of patients or folks who the company owes legal duties to, they may not have a choice, quite frankly, but to ultimately take action that they think is going to secure that data back into the enterprise. And there may be duties as well to that the management has to the board of directors, et cetera. But there's sort of this constellation of duties that can ultimately trump these. The countries can take policy considerations into account, but a lot of time private businesses, it's a function of the data as to what the nature of the duty is to recover it.
And we certainly don't see companies say, oh, I have a cyber policy, so I'm just going to pay, even though I have backups over here. I mean, that's unreasonable. A cyber carrier like me would say, well, no, that's not reasonable. We're not going to consent to that. We're not going to reimburse that because you have a viable backup option. And that hasn't happened, right? Companies are struggling with this decision. They're pursuing every alternative option. And at the end of the day, some have to pay. And it's been a really low percentage, actually, from our perspective. I don't know, Bill, you can comment, but from our perspective, we've seen less than 15% of the companies that have notified us actually make the payment. They really do try to find any alternative to doing that. And sometimes, like Bill said, we pursue dual tracks: recovery of backups, negotiation. And the longer the negotiation goes on, companies sometimes get really creative and like, oh, wait a minute, we have this other opportunity to restore, or maybe that data isn't as mission critical as we thought it was, and we can live without it.
Yeah, it's another great reason to slow down. If there's one really encouraging thing, it's like when an organization gets past like the first day mark, and they realize, well, we're not dead, like the sun still rose, and employees came in, and we're hamstrung here. It's really remarkable and really encouraging for us to the creative ways that they start finding ways to get their data back, right? It's like, oh, we realized all of our emails are cached locally and on machines, and while it kind of sucks, we can rebuild our Exchange server just through the local machines. Awesome. We found this incremental that's 2 weeks old, and we realized to bring it up to now, it would really just take $25,000 in manual data entry, and that'll take 2 weeks, but it's 100% sure bet. Great. So slowing down, has those benefits because, listen, if you make a snap decision, you're just like, pay, you've probably made the worst decision. You really haven't thought it through. And when you extend that period of time, you actually think about the business value of the data, where it resides, how to recover it. And that's when the outcomes really start to get better. And frankly, when the cost, it may sound crazy, when the time gets extended, the cost tends to go down overall.
Well, we're out of time, but we will be circulating, and if you try to find us, you can grab us and ask us any additional questions. Thank you so much for your time.